The thunder cracked like gunfire across the Malibu cliffs as rain hammered against bulletproof windows, but none of that explained the impossible sound. 3 deliberate knocks at a door no stranger should have been able to reach. Beckett froze mid-pour, expensive scotch forgotten, because his security system hadn't triggered a single alert. Through the peephole stood a child drenched to the bone, dark hair plastered against pale cheeks, clutching something against her chest with fingers blue from cold. Her eyes met the lens directly, as if she knew exactly where to look, and in that moment, every instinct he'd honed over 15 years screamed that this wasn't random. He opened the door to find her shivering violently, water pooling at her worn sneakers, yet she didn't move or speak. The wind whipped her wet hair across her face, and lightning illuminated the desperation carved into features far too young for such exhaustion. She simply stood there, waiting. "Who sent you?" The question came out harder than intended, but children didn't appear at reinforced doors on cliff tops during midnight storms. Her small hand extended, revealing an envelope so waterlogged the ink had started bleeding through, creating dark rivers across what looked like handwritten script. She still hadn't spoken, and that silence felt more unnatural than her presence. The storm roared behind her, ocean waves crashing against rocks 200 feet below, yet she remained perfectly still, except for the trembling. Her lips were starting to turn purple. Against every protocol he'd established, Beckett stepped aside and gestured her in. She moved with careful steps, leaving wet footprints on marble floors that had never seen a child's presence, her gaze sweeping the space with an awareness that seemed rehearsed. She stopped in the center of his living room, finally turning to face him. The resemblance hit him like a physical blow when she looked up, the specific curve of her eyebrows, the unusual amber flecks in otherwise dark eyes. His mind raced backward through faces and years while she continued watching him with that unnerving patience. She extended the letter again. "My mama said you'd remember her." The words came out hoarse, as if she'd been crying for hours before arriving. Her accent carried traces of somewhere rural, definitely not California, and her clothes smelled of bus stations and desperation. "She said you were the only one." Beckett took the envelope with hands that hadn't shaken during armed negotiations, but trembled now facing this soaked child. The handwriting on the front punched through his defenses, graceful loops he'd last seen on a napkin 5 years ago, a phone number he'd memorized but never called again. The name written there belonged to a past he'd carefully buried. "Where is she?" The question emerged rougher than intended, but the child's expression had already provided the answer. Her chin quivered once before she bit her lip, clearly fighting to maintain the composure someone had coached into her. Rain continued streaming from her hair onto his floor. "Mama died 3 weeks ago." She delivered the words with practiced flatness, as if repetition had worn away their sharp edges. "The hospital said pneumonia, but it got bad so fast. She made me promise to find you before she couldn't talk anymore." The letter felt impossibly heavy in his hands, still damp, still bleeding ink. Through the windows behind the child, lightning split the sky again, casting her small shadow across luxury she'd clearly never experienced. She swayed slightly, exhaustion catching up with whatever adrenaline had carried her this far. He broke the seal and unfolded pages that threatened to tear from water damage, and Marlena's handwriting swam before his eyes. The date at the top was barely legible, written just 4 days before this child said she'd died. His throat tightened reading the first line. "My name is Greer." The girl's voice pulled him from the page, steadier now despite her shaking. "I'm 7 years old and I took 3 buses to get here. Mama gave me your address and enough money for tickets. She said if anyone asked, I should say I was visiting my aunt." The calculated risk of that plan revealed Marlena's desperation more than any words could. She'd sent their daughter, and the pronoun crashed through his consciousness with brutal certainty, across state lines alone, gambling everything on his reaction. Greer watched him process this with eyes too ancient for her face. "She told me you lived in a castle by the ocean." Greer's gaze drifted to the floor-to-ceiling windows where storm clouds churned above violent waves. "She said you were the bravest person she ever knew, even though you scared other people. She wasn't scared of you." Beckett's chest constricted, because those were definitely Marlena's words, her way of seeing through the armor to something he'd stopped believing existed. He forced himself to return to the letter, where her handwriting grew shakier as the paragraphs progressed. She'd been dying as she wrote this. The child swayed again, and he caught her elbow instinctively as her knees buckled. She was burning with fever beneath the cold dampness, her skin radiating heat his hand could feel through her thin jacket. How long had she been sick before making this journey? Beckett guided Greer to the leather sofa, where she collapsed with a small whimper she tried to suppress. He grabbed a throw blanket from the nearby chair, wrapping it around her shoulders while his mind struggled to reconcile this feverish child with the bomb she'd just detonated in his carefully controlled world. Marlena's letter crinkled in his other hand. "When did you last eat?" The question came automatically, years of reading people kicking in despite his internal chaos. Greer's hesitation told him everything. She was calculating whether honesty might make her seem weak or burdensome. The calculation itself broke something in his chest. "Yesterday morning." She pulled the blanket tighter, her voice small. "The bus station vending machine. Mama left me $73 total, and the tickets cost $68. I saved the rest in case you weren't here." The pragmatism of a 7-year-old planning for rejection hit harder than most threats he'd faced. Beckett moved to his kitchen, a space he rarely used, muscle memory guiding him to bread and cheese. Behind him, Greer coughed, wet and rattling, the kind that demanded medical attention. He returned with a sandwich cut into quarters, watching her attack it with trembling hands while trying to maintain dignity. Marlena had taught her manners even in desperation, each small bite deliberate despite obvious hunger. The resemblance grew stronger with every passing second. Her profile matched memories he'd locked away. "Your mother and I met at an art gallery opening 6 years ago." The words emerged without permission, pulled out by Greer's expectant silence. "She was there covering it for some online magazine, and I was laundering money through the owner." She asked questions that should have made me walk away. But Marlena's curiosity had been infectious rather than threatening. Her genuine interest in the paintings, so different from the calculated networking around them. She'd cornered him near a particularly ugly abstract piece, declaring it pretentious nonsense, and he'd laughed for the first time in months. Greer listened while chewing carefully. "We started meeting at this terrible coffee shop in Santa Monica." The memories flooded back with dangerous clarity. Sunday mornings when his world paused, conversations that stretched for hours. She never asked what I did for work, and I never volunteered the information. For 4 months, I got to be someone normal. Greer swallowed her last bite, eyes fixed on his face with an intensity that mirrored her mother's focus. She was cataloging every micro-expression, learning to read him the way Marlena had. The blanket had slipped from one shoulder, revealing a faded dress that had been mended multiple times. Then someone from my organization saw us together at the pier. Beckett's jaw tightened, remembering that specific Sunday, the phone call that came 30 minutes after he'd kissed Marlena goodbye. My second-in-command called to inform me that fraternizing with civilians, especially journalists, violated every security protocol we had. He strongly suggested I end it. He'd spent 3 days convincing himself that cutting contact was protecting her, that his world would eventually consume anything good it touched. The 4th day, he'd shown up at her apartment to explain why they couldn't continue. Marlena had listened quietly, then asked a single question that gutted him. She wanted to know if you actually cared about her, or if she'd just been entertainment. Greer's voice carried no accusation, just stating facts she'd obviously been told. "Mama said you walked away without answering, and she understood that silence meant goodbye. She never blamed you." The sandwich plate sat empty between them, crumbs the only evidence of her hunger. Beckett forced himself to return to Marlena's letter, where her handwriting deteriorated further down the page. She'd discovered the pregnancy 2 weeks after their final conversation. "I found out I was carrying you the same day I accepted a job in Nevada." Greer recited the words as if she'd heard this story many times. Mama said she almost called him, but then she researched his name properly. She found articles about violence and arrests. She got scared, not for herself, but for me. Marlena had made the choice countless people in her position would make. She'd disappeared completely, changing her phone number and email, blocking him on every platform. She'd moved to a small town outside Reno where nobody knew her history. She'd built a quiet life teaching art classes and writing freelance pieces under a different name. She told me everything when I turned 6. Greer's fever-bright eyes never left his face, gauging his reaction to each revelation. "She said I deserved to know where I came from, even if we couldn't contact you. She showed me exactly 3 pictures she'd kept, all of them just you, none together." The detail stung, because it meant Marlena had been protecting him even in her private memories, maintaining plausible deniability if anyone ever searched her belongings. She'd loved him enough to erase herself from his life completely. The letter shook slightly in his grip. Everything was fine until last year. Greer's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, and Beckett leaned forward despite himself. Mama started getting tired all the time. She'd come home from teaching and just sleep. Then she started coughing. The free clinic said it was probably allergies. The progression she described sent ice through his veins. Delayed diagnosis, inadequate treatment, a single mother without insurance navigating a system designed to fail people like her. Marlena had apparently hidden the worst from Greer until hiding became impossible. The child pulled the blanket back up. By the time they figured out it was pneumonia, it had gotten really bad. Tears finally broke through Greer's composure, tracking down her flushed cheeks. They put her in the hospital, but she kept getting worse instead of better. She made me bring her notebook and pen 5 days before the end. Beckett watched Greer's tears fall, while his own remained locked behind decades of practiced control, but his hands curled into fists against the leather armrest. Marlena had died alone, except for a terrified child, in some understaffed county hospital, while he'd been closing a deal on a shipping container full of electronics. The timing felt like cosmic punishment. She wrote you 4 pages. Greer wiped her face with the blanket, leaving damp streaks on the expensive fabric. It took her 2 days because her hands kept shaking. The nurses said I had to leave at night, but I snuck back in through the service entrance. I read her the words to make sure they made sense. The image of this small girl coaching her dying mother through a final letter shattered something fundamental in his chest. He unfolded the remaining pages, where Marlena's handwriting devolved into barely controlled scrawls. Her message started with an apology he didn't deserve, and ended with a request that terrified him. Mama said you'd want proof. Greer's practical tone cut through his reading. She put my birth certificate in the envelope with her letter, also a DNA test kit, the kind you can mail in. She said you'd need documentation if you decided to, if you wanted to keep me. The clinical preparation in Marlena's dying days revealed how thoroughly she'd thought this through. She'd known he'd question, would need verification before upending his existence for a child who might not be his. The birth certificate listed father as unknown, protecting him even in official records. There's more stuff in my backpack. Greer gestured weakly toward a small bag he hadn't noticed by the door, camouflage pattern with a broken zipper. Mama's death certificate, medical records from the hospital, a paper saying I don't have any other family. She was an only child, and her parents died before I was born. The thoroughness was so quintessentially Marlena that Beckett's throat tightened. She'd packaged her daughter's entire existence into documentation that would satisfy lawyers and officials. She'd spent her final conscious hours ensuring Greer had the best possible chance at acceptance. The responsibility of that trust felt crushing. I also have her notebook. Greer's voice strengthened slightly, pride mixing with grief. She wrote in it every day since I was born. Stories about me, drawings, pressed flowers from places we visited. She said if you read it, you'd understand who she'd been after you last saw each other. Beckett set the letter down carefully, his strategic mind finally engaging past the emotional ambush. This child was burning with fever, hadn't slept in a proper bed for who knew how long, and needed medical attention before any other decisions could be made. Her eyelids were drooping despite obvious efforts to stay alert. When did you start feeling sick? He kept his voice level, non-threatening, the tone that made people trust him before they realized their mistake. Greer's hesitation confirmed she'd been hiding symptoms for days, powering through because stopping meant failing her mother's final mission. The second bus, I think. She coughed again, that wet rattle that spoke of fluid in her lungs. It got cold when we went through the mountains. My jacket isn't very thick, but I couldn't stop. Mama said I had to get here, had to make sure you got her letter personally. The determination in those words came straight from Marlena's stubborn core, that refusal to quit that had first attracted him. Greer had inherited more than just physical features. She'd absorbed her mother's steel spine and devastating single-mindedness. She swayed where she sat, fever clearly spiking. There's a guest room upstairs. Beckett stood, decision made despite his complete lack of preparation for this scenario. You need sleep, and tomorrow we're seeing a doctor. Everything else can wait until you're not running a fever high enough to fry an egg. Greer looked up at him with such naked hope that he nearly stepped back. She'd been braced for rejection, had probably rehearsed arguments and pleas during those 3 bus rides. His basic human decency registered as extraordinary kindness in her calculation. She struggled to stand, legs unsteady. He caught her automatically as she stumbled, her small weight almost nothing as he lifted her. She stiffened initially, clearly unused to being carried, then relaxed against his chest with a sigh that sounded like surrender, her head tucked under his chin, damp hair leaving wet spots on his shirt collar. The guest room had never housed anyone, existing as empty space in a house designed for isolation rather than hospitality. Beckett nudged the door open with his shoulder, revealing pale walls and furniture still wrapped in protective plastic. Greer's eyes widened at the size, probably bigger than wherever she'd lived with Marlena. He set her on the bed carefully, and she immediately curled into a ball, still wrapped in his blanket like armor. Her backpack sat by the door where he'd retrieved it, lumpy with everything she owned in the world. The room smelled sterile and unlived in, completely wrong for a sick child who'd just lost everything. "I don't have kids' clothes here." The admission felt absurd, given the larger impossibility of his situation. "Tomorrow I'll get you whatever you need. For tonight there's a bathroom through that door. Towels are in the cabinet. Do you need help with anything?" Greer shook her head, but her eyes tracked him as he moved toward the door. She was calculating again, trying to figure out if he'd still be there in the morning, or if this was elaborate rejection. Her fingers twisted in the blanket's edge, knuckles white with tension. "I'm not going anywhere." The promise emerged before he could stop it, binding him to a future he hadn't processed. "My room is down the hall, first door on the left. If you need anything, if you feel worse or get scared, you come find me. Understood?" She nodded slowly, some tension releasing from her small shoulders. Outside the windows, the storm had finally started to break, rain gentling to a steady patter against glass. Lightning flashed once more, illuminating Greer's face, Marlena's cheekbones, his eyes, a combination that erased any lingering doubt about paternity. Beckett retreated to the hallway, pulling the door mostly closed but leaving it cracked. He stood there listening to small movements as she explored the bathroom, water running, the toilet flushing. Eventually, silence fell, and he forced himself back downstairs to Marlena's letter. The final page contained no explanations or justifications, just a simple plea written in handwriting that barely qualified as legible. She begged him to see Greer as a person rather than an obligation, to give her daughter the chance at security and safety she'd never been able to provide. She asked for nothing for herself, not even forgiveness. Morning arrived with unexpected sunshine, the storm's violence replaced by crystalline light streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows that revealed the Pacific's deceptive calm. Beckett had spent most of the night on his leather sofa. Marlena's letter read so many times the paper had started to soften at the creases. Sleep had come in fragments, interrupted by listening for sounds from upstairs. Greer appeared in the kitchen doorway at 7:30, still wearing yesterday's clothes, hair tangled and face flushed with lingering fever. She'd wrapped herself in the blanket like a cloak, dragging it behind her as she navigated unfamiliar hallways. Her eyes were puffy from crying she'd clearly tried to muffle in the pillows. "There's a coffee maker, but I don't know what kids drink." Beckett's admission of incompetence felt safer than pretending expertise he didn't possess. The kitchen suddenly seemed enormous and threatening with her small presence in it, all sharp corners and appliances designed for someone who rarely cooked. She studied the marble island between them. "Mama usually made me oatmeal." Greer's voice came out raspy, her cough punctuating the sentence. "But I can eat cereal if that's easier. I'm not picky." She always said being picky was a luxury we couldn't afford. The casual mention of poverty stung worse than any accusation could have. While he'd been expanding his empire and sleeping in Egyptian cotton sheets, Marlena had been teaching their daughter that food preferences were financial indulgences. He opened cabinets he'd never explored, finding them embarrassingly bare except for protein powder and expensive coffee beans. "I'm calling a doctor to come here." He pulled out his phone, already scrolling through contacts. "Then we're getting you actual food and clothes that fit. After that, we'll figure out the rest." Greer's shoulders relaxed fractionally at the concrete plan, though wariness remained in her amber-flecked eyes. She climbed onto a bar stool with effort, the blanket pooling around her feet. Through the windows behind her, early morning surfers dotted the waves like seals, their world continuing oblivious to the revolution happening in his kitchen. The doctor arrived within 40 minutes, a discreet concierge physician who'd treated enough unusual situations to ask no questions about the feverish child at a bachelor's cliffside fortress. She examined Greer in the guest room while Beckett paced the hallway, catching fragments of gentle questions and Greer's cautious responses. The exam lasted 30 minutes that felt like hours. Bronchitis verging on pneumonia, definitely not helped by stress and inadequate nutrition. Dr. Shaw emerged with a prescription list and stern expression. She needs antibiotics, rest, and proper meals. Also, someone watching her constantly for the next 72 hours. If that fever spikes above 103, she goes to an ER immediately. The clinical assessment didn't capture Greer's hollowed cheeks or the way her collarbone protruded too sharply beneath thin fabric. Beckett took the prescriptions, already calculating which pharmacy would fill them without questions and deliver within the hour. Dr. Shaw's knowing look suggested she'd made similar calculations about his life before. She's also emotionally exhausted. Elaine, the doctor's voice dropped lower, professional distance cracking slightly. That child has been holding herself together through pure willpower. Now that she's delivered her mother's message, the adrenaline is crashing. Don't be surprised if she sleeps for 16 hours straight once the antibiotics kick in. Beckett returned to find Greer exactly where he'd left her, perched on the bed's edge like a bird ready to flee. She'd been examining the room's expensive emptiness, art-free walls, furniture without personality, space that existed as concept rather than home. Her small backpack sat beside her, everything she owned compressed into camouflage nylon. The doctor says you'll feel worse before you feel better. He handed her a bottle of water from the mini-fridge he hadn't known was stocked. Antibiotics should arrive in an hour. Until then, you're staying in bed. She accepted the water but didn't drink, just held it between both hands as if warming herself. Her gaze drifted to the windows where morning light painted everything gold, so different from whatever room she'd known before. A question formed and died on her lips, uncertainty written across features still learning to trust. Ask whatever you want. Beckett surprised himself with the invitation. I won't lie to you, even if the truth is complicated. Greer's fingers tightened around the water bottle, plastic crackling under pressure. She took a breath that turned into another coughing fit, her whole body shaking with the force of it. When she could speak again, her voice emerged smaller than before, but determined nonetheless. Are you going to keep me? The question landed like a grenade between them. Mama said you were good even though people thought you were dangerous. She said you'd never hurt a kid, but she also said you lived alone because your work was too important for family. So I need to know if I should start figuring out Plan B. The existence of a Plan B, a 7-year-old's contingency for rejection, crystallized everything wrong with the situation Marlena's death had created. Greer watched him with the wariness of someone who'd learned early that adults made promises they didn't keep. She'd prepared herself for the worst, while hoping desperately for something better. I'm not sending you anywhere. The commitment came easier the second time, settling into certainty despite its massive implications. You're staying here. We'll make it legal. Get you enrolled in school. Whatever needs to happen. Your mother trusted me with you, and I'm not going to fail that trust. Something crumbled behind Greer's careful facade. Not quite crying, but close. A release of tension she'd been carrying since Marlena first got sick. She set the water down and pulled the blanket tighter, nodding once as if confirming a business arrangement rather than her entire future. Her professionalism about it broke his heart. I'll try not to be too much trouble. Her whisper barely carried across the room. I'm good at being quiet and staying out of the way. Mama homeschooled me the last year because we moved a lot for her freelance work. I can keep up with lessons on my own if you're busy. The picture she painted of her previous life, constantly relocating, making herself invisible, learning independence as survival skill, stood in sharp contrast to the stability she deserved. Beckett moved to the window, looking out at the ocean rather than her two knowing eyes. A container ship crawled across the horizon, its progress steady and predictable. My work involves things I can't discuss. He chose his words carefully, aware she'd eventually learn exactly what he did. But it doesn't mean I'm too busy for you. Starting today, my priorities are different. You're not an inconvenience or a problem to manage. He couldn't finish the sentence, because claiming her as daughter felt presumptuous before DNA confirmation. But leaving her as random child felt like betrayal. Greer saved him from the semantic trap, with the perceptiveness Marlena had wielded like a weapon. Her small voice filled the silence with devastating accuracy. Mama said you were probably scared of being responsible for someone you could actually hurt, just by caring about them. She repeated the words like memorized scripture. She said that's why you walked away, not because you didn't love her, but because you did. She understood, even when it broke her heart. The antibiotics arrived via courier at 9:15, delivered in a plain bag that revealed nothing about the prescription inside, or the doctor who'd authorized it. Beckett watched Greer swallow the first dose with water she'd finally started sipping, her small throat working hard against pills designed for larger bodies. She grimaced but didn't complain, another learned behavior from a childhood without room for weakness. Sleep, now. He adjusted the blankets she'd kicked off during her earlier coughing fit, the gesture feeling foreign but necessary. I'll be downstairs making calls. Everything from here forward requires lawyers and paperwork, but that's not your problem. Your only job is getting better. Greer's eyes were already closing, fever and exhaustion finally overwhelming her determined consciousness. She mumbled something that might have been agreement, or might have been Marlena's name, her face relaxing into the vulnerability of genuine childhood for the first time since she'd appeared at his door. Beckett left the door cracked and descended to his office. The first call went to his attorney, a ruthless woman who'd successfully buried 3 separate federal investigations into his operations. She listened to his abbreviated explanation without interruption, and her silence after he finished carried more weight than questions would have. When she finally spoke, her tone had shifted from professional to something approaching concern. "You're talking about legal custody of a minor with zero preparation, questionable documentation, and a lifestyle that won't survive scrutiny." Her bluntness was why he paid her 6 figures annually. Best case scenario, you're looking at months of investigation. Worst case, Child Services removes her while they determine you're not a threat. There's no middle ground here. Beckett's hand tightened around his phone, as scenarios he hadn't considered cascaded through his mind. Social workers inspecting his home, background checks that would uncover carefully buried details, questions about his income sources and daily activities. Greer could end up in foster care while bureaucracy ground through processes designed to protect children from exactly the kind of man he was. Then we do it right from the beginning. He forced strategy to override emotion. DNA test today, file for emergency temporary custody by end of week. I'll need you to prepare documentation showing legitimate income streams and clean background. Whatever needs to happen to make me look like a viable guardian. His lawyer's exhale carried years of experience navigating impossible requests. She'd built her reputation making problems disappear. But this wasn't about concealing evidence. It was about creating a version of his life that could pass institutional inspection. The construction would require time and resources he'd normally spend on entirely different endeavors. "I'll send an independent lab tech this afternoon for the DNA collection." Her keyboard clicked in the background. "Results in 48 hours if we pay for the rush. Meanwhile, I'm drafting temporary guardianship papers. You'll need a home study, character references, proof of stable housing and income. This is going to cost you in ways that aren't just financial." The warning was unnecessary. Beckett had already calculated the price of legitimacy in a world that knew him by reputation rather than tax returns. His phone buzzed with an incoming text, even as he thanked his attorney and ended the call. The message came from his head of security, terse and concerning in its brevity. "Unknown individual inquiring about your address at the gate checkpoint. Claims to be family of a child who arrived last night. Denied entry but insistent. Advising immediate lockdown protocol." Ice flooded his veins as implications crystallized. No one should have known about Greer's arrival unless they'd been following her, which meant someone had deliberately let a sick 7-year-old complete her journey just to see where she'd lead them. He pulled up security camera footage on his laptop, scanning backward through the night's recordings. There, at 4:37 in the morning, a sedan with rental plates had parked 300 yards from his gate for 17 minutes before driving away. The angle was wrong for facial recognition, but the timing aligned perfectly with when Greer would have been inside telling her story. Someone had been watching and waiting. Beckett's second call went to his security chief, bypassing pleasantries for tactical assessment. The man's response confirmed his worst suspicions. The sedan's plates traced to a Las Vegas airport rental, picked up 2 days ago by someone using identification that wouldn't survive deeper scrutiny. Professional surveillance dressed up as civilian inquiry. The individual at the gate claimed to be the child's uncle, concerned about her welfare after a family tragedy. His security chief's tone suggested he'd already identified the claim as fabrication. Demanded we confirm whether a minor matching her description was present on the property. I told him to contact the police if he had legitimate concerns, and escorted him off-site. The word uncle triggered memory of Marlena's letter mentioning she'd been an only child. This supposed family member was either operating on bad intelligence or gambling that Beckett wouldn't know enough about Marlena's history to call the bluff. Either way, the approach was clumsy enough to suggest desperation rather than professional operation. "Pull everything on that rental. Where it's been, where it goes from here, any other locations it visited in the past 48 hours. Beckett's mind shifted into the mode that had kept him alive and wealthy, in a business where both were temporary conditions. Also, run Marlena's full background. I need to know if there's anyone from her life who'd have reason to track down her daughter. He climbed the stairs to check on Greer, finding her exactly as he'd left her, curled tight beneath blankets, face flushed with fever but breathing steadily. The innocence of her sleeping form contrasted sharply with the threat circling outside his walls. Someone knew she was here and wanted something. whether the child herself or leverage she represented. The DNA collection happened at 1:15. A quiet professional who took cheek swabs from both of them without comment or judgment. Beckett watched the samples disappear into sealed containers, evidence that would confirm what he already knew in his bones. Greer had inherited his eyes, Marlena's stubbornness, and a combination of genetics that made denial impossible. His phone rang again at 3 o'clock, this time showing his lawyer's personal cell rather than office line. She never used personal numbers unless information couldn't risk electronic trails through her firm's systems. He answered expecting bad news, and received something worse than anticipated. Your mysterious visitor didn't give up after your security rebuffed him. Her voice carried tension he'd rarely heard. He went to the county clerk's office with a petition for emergency custody, claiming to be the maternal uncle of an endangered minor, filed under the name Philip Vance, listing a Las Vegas address. The petition alleges you're an unfit guardian due to criminal associations. The strategic play revealed itself. Establish official concern through legal channels. Force the system to investigate Beckett's background. Create chaos that might result in Greer's removal to state custody where she'd be vulnerable. Someone wanted access to her badly enough to attack through bureaucratic channels when direct approach failed. Marlena's maiden name was Vance. Beckett pulled up the birth certificate from her envelope, confirming the detail. But her letter specifically said she was an only child. Either this guy is a cousin trading on shared surname, or he's lying completely and gambling we can't disprove his claim fast enough. His lawyer's silence carried weight as she processed angles and countermoves. When she spoke again, her tone had shifted to the dangerous calm that preceded her most ruthless legal strategies. She'd built a career destroying people who underestimated her, and someone had just made that fatal miscalculation. If he's legitimate family, he'd have photos, shared history, documentation proving his relationship to Marlena. Her words came crisp and certain. We demand immediate proof in our counterfiling. Meanwhile, I'm requesting an emergency hearing to establish your temporary guardianship before his petition gains traction. We're filing today. Hearing by Friday at the latest. Beckett ended the call and returned to Greer's room, watching her sleep while storm clouds gathered in a different form than last night's weather. She'd traveled across state lines seeking safety, and instead, she'd brought trouble to his door. The question was whether that trouble had followed her or been waiting for her to lead them here all along. The emergency hearing was scheduled for Thursday morning at 9 o'clock, giving them exactly 73 hours to prepare a case that would determine Greer's immediate future. Beckett spent Tuesday evening reviewing character references his lawyer had compiled with terrifying efficiency, business associates willing to testify about his legitimate investments, a charity director grateful for his anonymous donations, even a city councilman he'd helped elect through legal campaign contributions. The construction of his respectable persona felt like building a theater set, all facade and strategic lighting, but it was necessary architecture for navigating systems designed to exclude men like him. His phone rang Wednesday morning while he was watching Greer eat actual breakfast, scrambled eggs and toast she'd approached with the caution of someone expecting disappointment. The caller ID showed his lawyer's office. I'm sending someone to interview you this afternoon. Her voice carried unusual warmth beneath professional efficiency. Normally I'd handle custody cases myself, but you need a specialist. Harlow Preston is the best family law attorney on the West Coast. She's expensive, brilliant, and has a personal history that makes her particularly effective in unusual circumstances. The name meant nothing to him, but his lawyer rarely made recommendations without strategic reasoning. He agreed to the 3 o'clock meeting and returned his attention to Greer, who'd finished her eggs and was studying his kitchen with the analytical focus she brought to everything. Her fever had broken overnight, leaving her weak, but noticeably more present. Someone's coming to talk to us today. He kept his tone casual, aware that every adult conversation now required translation for a 7-year-old audience. A lawyer who specializes in families. She'll ask questions about your mom, about how you ended up here. Just tell her the truth. That's all anyone needs. Greer nodded slowly, fingers tracing patterns in her toast crumbs. She'd been quieter this morning, the reality of her situation settling in now that immediate crisis had passed. Her occasional glances toward the windows suggested she was cataloging escape routes, old survival instincts not yet convinced safety was permanent. Harlow Preston arrived precisely at 3, and Beckett's first impression was controlled chaos. Expensive suit slightly rumpled, leather briefcase covered in travel stickers, dark hair escaping from pins that had clearly lost their battle hours ago. She moved with the confidence of someone who'd stopped caring about conventional presentation because her results spoke louder than her appearance. You must be Beckett. She extended her hand with a grip that matched his own pressure. "And you're Greer. I brought something for you." She pulled a worn paperback from her briefcase, some fantasy novel with a dragon on the cover, and handed it to the startled child. Greer accepted it with the suspicious gratitude of someone unused to unsolicited kindness, immediately checking the price on the back cover. The book was used but well-maintained, clearly from personal collection rather than store purchase. "I was 8 when I read that." Harlow settled into the chair across from them without waiting for invitation. "My foster mother gave it to me the day I arrived at her house. It was the first time anyone had given me something just because they thought I'd like it, not because it was my birthday or Christmas or some official occasion requiring gifts." The casual mention of foster care recontextualized everything about her presence. This wasn't just another lawyer collecting billable hours, but someone who'd lived a version of Greer's current fear. The child's grip on the book tightened, and Beckett saw calculation behind her amber-flecked eyes as she measured this new adult against past disappointments. "Your previous lawyer briefed me on the situation." Harlow pulled out a legal pad covered in dense handwriting. "But I need to hear it directly from you. Not the legal version or strategic presentation. The actual truth about how a 7-year-old ended up at your door and why you're fighting to keep her." The invitation to honesty felt like a trap, but Beckett had survived worse interrogations than family court proceedings. He walked her through the timeline. Marlena, their relationship, the pregnancy he'd never known about, the letter that arrived with a dying woman's final request. Harlow listened without interruption, occasionally making notes, but mostly watching his face with the intensity of someone reading between the lines. "And you?" She turned to Greer with the same direct focus. "Tell me about your mom. What was she like when she was healthy? What did you two do together?" The question opened something in Greer that questions about logistics and timelines hadn't touched. She started talking about Sunday morning pancake breakfasts with chocolate chips arranged in smiley faces, about Marlena teaching her to draw using cheap markers from dollar stores, about the game they'd played where every sunset got rated on a scale of 1 to 10 for color quality. Harlow let her talk uninterrupted for 20 minutes, and Beckett watched his daughter, the word settling more firmly each time he thought it, transform from guarded refugee to animated child. She described her mother with such specific detail that Marlena became present in the room, her love evident in every small ritual and creative workaround for poverty they'd practiced together. "She sounds like she was an extraordinary woman." Harlow's voice carried genuine respect rather than platitude. "And she trusted you with her most precious person, which suggests she knew something about you that maybe even you don't fully recognize yet." The observation landed with unexpected weight, particularly coming from someone who'd spent maybe an hour in his presence. Beckett shifted uncomfortably while Greer nodded with the certainty of someone who'd been told this exact thing. Marlena's faith in him felt like responsibility and accusation combined. "Here's what's going to happen." Harlow's tone shifted to business efficiency. "This Philip Vance claiming to be family is fishing. He submitted a petition without proper documentation because he's hoping bureaucratic momentum will work in his favor. We're going to crush that immediately by demanding proof he can't provide, while simultaneously establishing your legitimacy." She outlined a strategy that involved DNA results they'd receive tomorrow, expedited background checks that would highlight his legitimate business interests while burying everything problematic, and testimony from Dr. Shaw about Greer's medical condition and his appropriate response to it. The hearing would become a referendum not on his past, but on his present capacity to provide stability. "I need to ask something difficult." Harlow's gaze settled on him with uncomfortable directness. "Is there any possibility this Vance character is connected to your professional activities? Could someone be using this child as leverage against you?" The question he'd been avoiding crystallized into focus. His enemies were numerous and creative, and a vulnerable child represented opportunity for those who'd failed to find other weaknesses. But the timing suggested something different. Vance had moved too quickly, known too much about Greer's arrival, operated with the desperation of someone racing against a deadline. "I think he was following Marlena before she died." The theory formed as he spoke it aloud, waiting to see what she'd do with her daughter, maybe hoping to intercept the child before she reached me. When Greer completed her journey successfully, he had to shift tactics. Harlow's expression suggested she'd reached similar conclusions. She turned to Greer with a gentleness that didn't diminish her directness. "Did anyone approach you during your bus trips? Ask questions about where you were going or who you were visiting?" Greer's face scrunched in concentration, replaying memories of a journey that must have been terrifying despite her brave recounting of it. Her fingers stilled on the book's cover as something surfaced. "On the second bus, a man asked if I was traveling alone. He seemed worried, said kids shouldn't be by themselves. I told him I was meeting my aunt in Los Angeles like Mama taught me to say. What did he look like? Beckett kept his voice calm, despite adrenaline sharpening his focus. Greer's description came haltingly. Tall, maybe 40, wearing a college sweatshirt with a logo she couldn't remember. Baseball cap pulled low. Generic enough to be anyone, specific enough to confirm she'd been marked. He got off at the next stop. Greer's voice dropped to a whisper. But I saw the same sweatshirt at the Los Angeles station. Maybe it was a different person. Or maybe I was just scared and seeing things. I hid in the bathroom until my next bus was boarding. The 7-year-old's survival instincts had likely saved her from direct approach, forcing Vance to track her final destination rather than intercept mid-journey. Harlow made notes with sharp, angry strokes, her professional mask cracking to reveal fury at adults who'd terrorize a grieving child. When she looked up, her expression promised consequences. Thursday's hearing just became about more than custody. Her words carried the weight of declared war. We're going to expose whoever this person is and ensure they face every legal penalty available. No one hunts a child without answering for it. Thursday morning arrived with fog rolling off the Pacific, shrouding the cliffside house in gray that matched Beckett's mood as he adjusted his tie in the mirror. He'd chosen the most conservative suit he owned, transforming himself into the kind of man judges trusted with vulnerable children. The performance felt necessary and dishonest in equal measure. Greer emerged from her room wearing new clothes Harlow had delivered yesterday, a simple dress in navy blue that made her look simultaneously older and more fragile. She'd attempted to brush her hair into submission, the result lopsided but earnest. Her hands twisted together with nervous energy that no 7-year-old should carry into a courtroom. Remember what we talked about? Harlow appeared in the hallway, her own armor of pressed suit and controlled hair transforming yesterday's casual warmth into courtroom weapon. You tell the truth. If you don't understand a question, you say so. If you need a break, you tell the judge. No one expects you to be perfect. They expect you to be honest. The drive to the courthouse passed in tense silence, Beckett's security detail following at discreet distance, while Greer pressed her face against the window, watching unfamiliar neighborhoods slide past. She'd never been to Los Angeles proper, and the density of buildings and people seemed to overwhelm her rural sensibilities. Her breathing quickened as they approached the brutalist concrete structure housing family court. Philip Vance waited in the hallway outside the courtroom, and Beckett cataloged details with practiced assessment. Expensive watch that didn't match his off-rack suit, shoes too new to be regularly worn, nervous energy of someone playing a role. The man's gaze locked onto Greer, with an intensity that made her shrink behind Beckett's legs. Whatever his agenda, it centered entirely on the child. That's her, right? Vance addressed his own attorney, a tired-looking public defender who seemed to regret taking this case. She looks just like my sister did at that age. I'd know my own niece anywhere. The claim rang hollow, because he'd just admitted he'd never actually met Greer before, undermining his entire petition with desperate overreach. Harlow's expression suggested she'd caught the same slip, her legal pad already recording the self-inflicted wound. She positioned herself between Vance and Greer with deliberate physicality. Judge Morrison entered at precisely 9 o'clock, a woman in her 60s whose reputation for no-nonsense rulings preceded her. She surveyed the assembled parties with the exhaustion of someone who'd seen every variation of family tragedy and dysfunction. Her gaze lingered on Greer with something approaching sympathy before hardening into professional assessment. This is an emergency petition for temporary custody filed by Philip Vance regarding a minor child named Greer. The judge's voice carried the weight of absolute authority. Mr. Vance claims to be the maternal uncle and argues that current placement with... She consulted her papers. Beckett Hayes presents danger to the child's welfare. Mr. Hayes has counterfiled for emergency temporary guardianship. We'll hear Mr. Vance's evidence first. Vance's attorney stumbled through an opening statement that relied heavily on emotional appeals about family bonds while providing zero documentation of actual relationship. He presented no photos, no correspondence with Marlena, no evidence of existence in her life or Greer's. His entire case rested on shared surname and self-proclaimed concern for a niece he'd never tried to contact until she'd inconveniently landed with someone else. Do you have any proof of your biological relationship to the deceased mother? Judge Morrison's interruption cut through the attorney's rambling. Birth certificates, family photos, witnesses who can testify to your presence in her life. The silence that followed spoke volumes. Vance's attorney shuffled papers with increasing desperation, while his client's face reddened with poorly concealed anger. Finally, the lawyer admitted they were still gathering documentation, but insisted blood relationship was obvious, given physical similarities. The judge's expression suggested she'd heard more convincing arguments from parking violators. "What was your sister's favorite color?" Harlow's question came during her cross-examination. Deceptively simple and absolutely devastating. Vance blinked, mouth opening and closing without sound. What instrument did she play in high school? What was her college major? Where did she work before she died? Basic information any sibling would know. Vance's continued silence answered more effectively than words could have. He'd gambled that documentation gaps wouldn't matter if he moved quickly enough, that the system's default protectiveness toward biological family would override scrutiny of his claims. Instead, he'd revealed himself as exactly what Beckett suspected, an opportunist with an agenda that had nothing to do with Greer's welfare. "I knew Marlena through mutual friends." The admission emerged grudgingly, his cover story collapsing under minimal pressure. "When I heard she died leaving a child alone, I felt obligated to step forward. The kid deserves family, not some—" He gestured toward Beckett with barely concealed contempt. "Criminal raising her in whatever dangerous world he operates in." The outburst confirmed his strategy. Discredit Beckett so thoroughly that even a false uncle looked preferable. Judge Morrison's expression shifted from skeptical to actively hostile as she made notes that couldn't bode well for Vance's petition. Harlow let the silence stretch, giving his words time to fully incriminate him before proceeding. "Let's discuss how you learned about Marlena's death and her daughter's whereabouts." Harlow's tone remained pleasant, despite the trap she was setting. The deceased lived in Nevada under a different name, working freelance with minimal online presence. Her death wasn't widely reported, yet you somehow knew she'd died, knew she had a daughter, and knew exactly when that child would arrive at Mr. Hayes's residence. Explain that timeline. Vance's face cycled through expressions as he calculated how much truth he could afford to reveal. His attorney placed a restraining hand on his arm, clearly recognizing the legal quicksand opening before them. The pause extended uncomfortably while Judge Morrison's impatience became palpable. When Vance finally spoke, his words emerged too carefully. "I had been in contact with Marlena recently regarding family matters." The lie was evident in his inability to maintain eye contact. She mentioned her health concerns and her daughter's future. When I learned of her death through channels, I naturally wanted to ensure the child's safety. Harlow smiled with the satisfaction of someone whose opponent had just walked into prepared territory. She pulled documents from her briefcase with theatrical precision, handing copies to the judge and Vance's attorney. Phone records, Marlena's final medical records, statements from her landlord and neighbors, none of them mentioning anyone matching Vance's description or any family contact in her final months. These records show Marlena specifically told her hospice nurse that she had no living family except her daughter. Harlow's voice remained steady as she demolished Vance's narrative. She made arrangements to ensure Greer would reach Mr. Hayes precisely because he was the only person she trusted. Your supposed family connection is a fabrication, and your knowledge of this child's movements suggests surveillance that frankly borders on stalking. Judge Morrison's ruling came swiftly, after 15 minutes of deliberation that felt like hours. Philip Vance's petition was denied with prejudice, meaning he couldn't refile without substantial new evidence. She granted Beckett emergency temporary custody for 90 days, contingent on home studies and follow-up evaluations. The gavel's crack felt like thunder, and Greer's small hand found his instinctively. Vance's face contorted with rage as he stormed from the courtroom, his attorney trailing with apologetic shrugs toward the judge. Security intercepted him at the exit when he tried to approach them, his shouted threats about appeals and justice echoing off marble walls. Whatever his true motivation had been, it remained obscured behind the desperation of a failed gambit. That man is going to be investigated thoroughly. Harlow's satisfaction was evident as they exited into afternoon sunshine that felt celebratory. I've already filed complaints with the state bar about his fraudulent claims, and I suspect law enforcement will want to know why he was tracking a minor child across state lines. He picked the wrong family to target. The drive back to Malibu passed in lighter silence, tension replaced by exhausted relief. Greer had fallen asleep in the back seat within minutes, her body finally surrendering to weeks of accumulated stress. Beckett watched her in the rearview mirror, this small person who'd reorganized his entire existence in less than a week. The weekend arrived with unexpected normalcy. Saturday morning, bringing Greer downstairs in pajamas, asking about breakfast as if she'd lived there for years. Beckett found himself researching pancake recipes on his phone, attempting to recreate the chocolate chip smiley faces she'd mentioned her mother making. His first attempt produced something closer to abstract art than recognizable shapes. Greer's laughter at his culinary failure felt like victory despite the burnt edges and lopsided circles. She climbed onto the counter to supervise his second attempt, offering commentary that suggested Marlena had taught her more about cooking than he'd ever learned. Together they produced something edible, and the shared accomplishment mattered more than the mediocre taste. The doorbell interrupted their breakfast, and Beckett answered to find a delivery of art supplies he'd ordered without consulting Greer. Sketch pads, colored pencils, watercolors, brushes, everything she'd need to continue the creative legacy Marlena had nurtured. Her expression when she saw the boxes shifted through disbelief to overwhelming emotion, tears spilling before she could stop them. Mama always bought the cheapest supplies because that's what we could afford. She touched the professional-grade pencils with reverent fingers. She said someday when things were better, I could have the good stuff. She'd be so happy knowing I finally got it. Harlow had declined his invitation to return to the house, claiming other cases demanded attention, but her expression suggested she was giving them space to process their new reality. She'd promised to return next week for the first home study preparation, armed with checklists and recommendations. Her parting words carried weight beyond their simple phrasing. You did something extraordinary today. She'd paused at her car, briefcase already stowed but clearly wanting to say more. Most people in your position would have chosen the easier path. Let the system handle her, write checks from a distance, maintain plausible deniability. You chose the harder thing because it was right. Greer is lucky to have you. The compliment sat uncomfortably because he didn't feel extraordinary, just responsible for promises made by a dying woman he'd once loved. But watching Greer sleep through their arrival home, he recognized something shifting. She wasn't just Marlena's daughter anymore, wasn't just an obligation to honor. She was becoming his in ways that had nothing to do with DNA confirmation still pending. He carried her inside and up to her room, where she mumbled protests about being awake enough to walk, before immediately contradicting herself by burrowing into pillows. Her fever hadn't returned since the antibiotics kicked in, and color had started returning to cheeks that had been too pale. Dr. Shaw's prediction of recovery was manifesting ahead of schedule. Did we win? Greer's question emerged sleepy and small, as Beckett pulled the blanket over her. Her eyes remained closed, but tension lingered in her shoulders. Is that man going to take me away? We won. The confirmation felt good to speak aloud. You're staying here. No one is taking you anywhere. Her shoulders finally relaxed, and within seconds her breathing evened into genuine sleep. Beckett stood watching her for longer than necessary. This accidental daughter who'd crashed into his carefully controlled world and demolished every wall he'd constructed. The DNA results would arrive tomorrow, but they'd become redundant. She was his, regardless of what science confirmed. His phone buzzed with a text from Harlow. Simple and direct. Dinner next week to celebrate? My treat. You've earned it. The invitation carried layers beyond professional courtesy. Interest masked as gratitude. Connection built through shared intensity of the past week. Beckett recognized the dynamic, because he'd deployed similar strategies himself in different contexts. But Harlow's directness appealed in its honesty. Her refusal to pretend their attraction was purely coincidental or professional. He responded with agreement before he could overthink the implications, then descended to his office where work had been accumulating during his unexpected foray into parenthood. His second-in-command had been running operations with minimal guidance, a test of delegation that revealed both strengths and gaps in their organization. Several decisions required his attention, but concentration fractured repeatedly as his gaze drifted to the security monitors showing Greer's room, to the photo of Marlena he'd finally framed and placed on his desk, to the future he was constructing one decision at a time. His empire of carefully managed violence and strategic intimidation seemed increasingly incompatible with raising a child who deserved better than his world offered. The DNA results arrived Friday morning via encrypted email, clinical confirmation of what his heart had already accepted. 99.97% probability of paternity, the remaining fraction existing only because absolute certainty was scientifically impossible. He printed the document and placed it in the folder Harlow had prepared, evidence for systems that required proof beyond what he already knew. Greer appeared in his office doorway at 10 o'clock, still wearing pajamas and holding the fantasy novel Harlow had given her. She'd clearly been reading through the night, based on how far the bookmark had advanced. Her presence in his space felt natural now, the house adjusting to accommodate her existence in it. Can we do something today? The question came with typical 7-year-old vagueness, wanting activity without specific preference. Not staying inside, maybe seeing the ocean up close. I've only ever seen it from your windows. The simple request highlighted how little he knew about providing childhood experiences. His own had been fractured and violent, lessons learned through necessity rather than gentle guidance. But Greer deserved better than his history, deserved the kind of simple joys Marlena had apparently crafted from limited resources and unlimited love. Beach day it is. The decision came easier than expected. Go get dressed in something that can get sandy. We'll grab breakfast on the way and spend the whole day doing absolutely nothing productive. Her answering smile transformed her face into pure childhood delight, erasing the worry lines that had seemed permanent since her arrival. She disappeared upstairs with excited energy he hadn't seen from her before, and he heard drawers opening as she searched through the new clothes that had been steadily arriving all week. The beach was surprisingly empty for a Friday, locals having abandoned it to weekend tourists who hadn't yet arrived. Beckett spread the blanket he'd purchased specifically for this outing, his first beach blanket at an age when most people had collected dozens. Greer kicked off her shoes and ran toward the water with abandon he hadn't known she possessed, her caution finally cracking under California sunshine. He watched her dance in the shallow waves, squealing when cold water surprised her, collecting shells with the focused intensity she brought to everything. Other families dotted the sand in clusters, their easy domesticity highlighting how foreign this experience remained for him. But Greer's laughter carried on the salt air, and that sound justified every uncomfortable step into unfamiliar territory. "You're doing better than you think," Harlow's voice startled him from behind, her appearance unexpected, but somehow inevitable. She'd traded her courtroom armor for casual clothes that suggested she'd come straight from other plans rather than work. "I was driving past and saw you two. Figured I'd stop and say hello rather than being creepy and just watching from the parking lot." The honesty of her admission made him laugh, tension he hadn't realized he was carrying releasing with the sound. She settled onto the blanket without invitation, comfortable in her presumption of welcome. Together they watched Greer construct an elaborate sandcastle, her tongue poking out in concentration as she fortified walls against inevitable tide. "My foster mother used to bring me here." Harlow's voice carried memories that explained her easy familiarity with this stretch of beach. "Every Saturday morning for 3 years until I aged out of the system. She'd pack terrible sandwiches with too much mayonnaise, and we'd sit exactly here watching the surfers. Those mornings saved my life in ways I didn't understand until much later. The shared history created bridge between his world and hers, their respective paths to this moment converging through different brands of survival." Greer noticed Harlow's presence and waved, her suspicion of new adults clearly diminishing when they appeared in positive contexts. She returned to her construction with renewed focus, occasionally glancing back to ensure they remained present. "I meant what I said about dinner." Harlow's directness cut through any pretense about her intentions. "Not as your lawyer. We can keep that relationship completely separate. As someone who'd like to know you better outside of crisis management and custody hearings, if that's something you'd be interested in exploring." Beckett studied her profile as she watched Greer, noting the softness beneath her professional sharpness, the vulnerability in admitting interest, rather than waiting for him to make first moves. His life had been constructed around control and strategic advantage, but something about her straightforward approach bypassed his usual calculations. He found himself wanting to say yes, for reasons that had nothing to do with strategy. "Dinner sounds good." His acceptance came without the hedging he'd normally employ. "Next Friday? Somewhere that serves terrible mayonnaise sandwiches in honor of your foster mother's questionable culinary skills." Her laugh was genuine and unguarded, transforming her face into something younger than courtroom battles had left it. They sat in comfortable silence while Greer added increasingly elaborate details to her sandcastle, a moat that immediately filled with seawater, a drawbridge constructed from driftwood. The architecture of childhood imagination made manifest in temporary sand. The afternoon stretched golden as the sun arced toward the horizon, painting everything in amber light that made the moment feel suspended outside normal time. Greer finally abandoned her construction to collapse on the blanket between them, sand crusted in her hair and salt drying on her skin. Her contentment was palpable, exhaustion earned through play rather than stress. "Can we come back tomorrow?" The question carried hope rather than demand, as if she still couldn't quite believe good things might be repeatable. And maybe Harlow could come too? She probably knows the best spots for finding whole shells instead of broken ones. The casual inclusion of Harlow in her future plans suggested Greer's instincts about trust, her ability to recognize safety in adults who'd proven themselves through actions rather than promises. Harlow's surprised pleasure at the invitation revealed she hadn't expected acceptance from the child she'd initially met as professional obligation. Her response came gentle and genuine. I'd love that. She reached over to brush sand from Greer's hair with unself-conscious affection. And I definitely know where the good shells hide. My foster mother taught me all the secret spots before I moved on. The catch in her voice suggested a loss she rarely discussed, parallel grief to what Greer carried about Marlena. The shared understanding of absence created instant bond between them, recognition that some wounds never fully healed but could be honored rather than hidden. Greer nodded with the solemnity of someone who understood exactly what Harlow wasn't saying. They stayed until sunset painted the sky in colors worthy of Marlena's rating system, easily a 9, maybe a 10, depending on how generous the scoring felt. Greer debated the merits while they packed up, her arguments for higher scores based on criteria only she understood. Beckett listened to her chatter with attention that would have been impossible a month ago. Monday brought the first home study appointment, a social worker named Patricia Chen, whose kind eyes missed nothing as she toured the house. She noted the art supplies scattered across the dining table, the half-finished drawing Greer had abandoned when the doorbell rang, the cherry tree visible through the windows already showing signs of taking root. Her questions came gently, but probed deeply into their daily routines. Greer answered with surprising confidence, describing breakfast experiments and beach trips, and the book she was reading before bed. She showed Patricia her room, now decorated with drawings she'd created, and photographs of Marlena that Beckett had printed and framed. The social worker's expression softened watching their interaction, the genuine affection that had developed despite impossible circumstances. I've seen a lot of placements in my career. Patricia's words came as she prepared to leave, her assessment complete. Most of them take months to develop the kind of bond I'm seeing here. Whatever you're doing, it's working. That child feels safe with you in ways that can't be faked or rushed. The validation mattered more than Beckett expected. External confirmation that his instincts weren't completely wrong. Patricia scheduled follow-up visits, but suggested they were formality rather than concern. Her report likely to support permanent custody when the 90-day temporary period ended. Greer waved goodbye from the window, already returning to her art project. The drive home passed with Greer's sleepy commentary about their day, her plans for tomorrow's shell hunting, her idea that they should plant something in the garden to remember her mama. The suggestion landed with unexpected weight. Marlena deserved memorial beyond legal documents and private grief, deserved acknowledgement in the physical world they were building without her. What kind of tree did your mother like? Beckett kept his voice steady despite emotion threatening to crack it. 2. In the rearview mirror, Greer's face lit up with memories that were painful and precious simultaneously. Cherry trees. The answer came immediate and certain. She said they were hopeful because they bloomed even when it was still cold outside. They promised spring was coming even when winter felt permanent. We saw them in pictures because they don't really grow in Nevada, but she always said if we ever lived somewhere nice, we'd plant one. The specificity of the memory suggested conversations they'd had multiple times, dreams Marlena had nurtured even when circumstances suggested they'd remain fantasy. Beckett made mental notes about sourcing a cherry tree, about creating the garden space Greer had envisioned, about building a memorial that honored the woman who'd trusted him with everything that mattered. Sunday morning dawned clear and perfect, the kind of California day that justified the state's impossible cost of living. The cherry tree arrived at 10 o'clock, a young sapling with delicate branches that promised future blossoms. Greer supervised its placement in the garden with the seriousness of someone orchestrating something sacred, directing the landscapers with precision about angle and depth. Harlow appeared as they were tamping soil around the base, carrying a bag from a garden center that revealed her own preparation for this moment. She pulled out smooth river stones and a metallic garden marker, components for memorial that went beyond simple planting. Together, the three of them arranged stones in a circle around the tree's base, while Greer decided what words should mark her mother's memory. Marlena, who made every sunset beautiful and taught me that cherry trees bloom in winter. Greer's words were simple and perfect, capturing essence rather than attempting comprehensiveness. Harlow transcribed them onto the marker with careful lettering, creating permanence from temporary grief. They stood in silence as she pressed it into the earth. "Thank you for taking care of me." Greer's whisper was directed at the tree, at her mother's memory, at the universe that had delivered her to this unlikely sanctuary. "I'm going to be okay here. He's scary to other people, but you were right. He's not scary to us." Beckett's throat tightened at the assessment delivered with 7-year-old certainty, at the trust he'd somehow earned despite his complete lack of preparation for this role. Harlow's hand found his, her grip steady and grounding, her presence beside him feeling increasingly like choice rather than coincidence. Above them, the young cherry tree's branches moved in the ocean breeze. That evening they sat together on the deck watching stars emerge over the Pacific, Greer wrapped in blankets despite the mild temperature, hot chocolate in her hands that she'd insisted on making herself. She'd been quieter since the tree planting, processing grief and gratitude in whatever ways children learn to hold both simultaneously. When she finally spoke, her words carried weight beyond her years. I think Mama knew exactly what she was doing when she sent me here. She didn't look at either adult, keeping her gaze on the darkening horizon. She could have told you about me any time, but she waited until she knew she was dying, because that way you couldn't say no without being the kind of person who abandons kids. She trapped you into keeping me by making it impossible to refuse. The strategic analysis was so accurate and so much like Marlena's calculated thinking that Beckett couldn't help his bark of surprised laughter. Greer was right. Her mother had executed a perfect manipulation, using his own sense of honor and her final wishes to ensure he'd accept responsibility he'd never chosen. The realization should have angered him, but instead filled him with admiration for the woman who'd loved him enough to gamble everything on his character. Your mother was brilliant. He stated it as simple fact. And she was right about me. I'm keeping you not because I was trapped, but because I can't imagine my life without you in it anymore. You showed up uninvited and completely changed everything, and I'm grateful for it even when it's terrifying. Greer turned to look at him directly, her amber-flecked eyes, his eyes reflecting starlight and something like peace. She'd found safety in the last place anyone would have predicted, with the most unlikely guardian imaginable. But Marlena had seen past his dangerous reputation to something worth trusting, and her faith was being validated one small moment at a time. Thank you all for following Greer and Beckett's journey. If you've connected with their story of unexpected family and second chances, write in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video. Your support means everything and helps me continue bringing these stories to life.